Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're on a mission to understand how those massive investments in rail actually happen. Those shiny new high-speed lines, all those train cars for our daily commute.
It's all about rail demand forecasting.
Right, because before they lay down a single track or order another train car, someone has to figure out how many people are actually going to use them. And not just today, but years, even decades down the line.
Precisely. We're talking billions of dollars on the line, so those predictions have got to be rock solid.
So no pressure then. We've got a stack of research here, and honestly, it looks like predicting the future of rail travel is no easy feat.
It's a real mixed bag. You've got everything from quick and dirty statistical projections to these incredibly complex models that factor in everything but the kitchen sink.
Speaking of kitchens, is there a recipe for choosing the right forecasting tool? I mean, where do you even begin?
Well, it all depends on what you're trying to predict and how much information you have to work with. Sometimes a simple statistical projection can be a good starting point.
Right, like those linear regressions we all learned about in school.
Exactly. You're basically plotting passenger numbers on a graph, drawing a straight line through those points and extending it into the future.
Sounds simple enough, but I'm guessing it's not always that straightforward.
You got it. Let's say you're trying to predict Eurostar ridership back in 2011, right after they opened that new tunnel. A simple linear projection might show steady growth, but it wouldn't account for the massive surge in popularity they saw in the early 2000s.
So a straight line wouldn't really capture the nuances of that situation. What about something like an exponential curve? Doesn't that account for faster growth?
It does, and that might be a better fit for some situations. But even then, you're still relying solely on past trends. What if some major external factor comes along and throws everything off course?
Okay, so you're saying those simple projections have their limitations. What about those more complex models you mentioned? The ones that try to factor in all those external forces?
You're talking about econometric models. Those are like the detectives of the forecasting world. They don't just look at what happened, but they try to figure out why.
Interesting. So instead of just charting how many people rode the train, they're trying to figure out what drove those people to choose rail in the first place.
Exactly. Think ticket prices, travel times compared to driving or flying, the overall health of the economy, even things like government policies that might incentivize or discourage rail travel.
So it's about connecting the dots between all these different factors and how they influence people's travel choices.
Exactly. For example, one study we looked at analyzed Greek rail demand, and they factored in things like car ownership rates, how competitive bus fares were, even a change in how they counted tickets back in the 70s.
Wow, that's incredibly detailed. But it sounds like those econometric models would be pretty data hungry. What happens when you're trying to forecast demand for something totally new, like a high-speed rail line that hasn't even been built yet? You don't have any historical data to feed into those models.
That's when you might turn to qualitative methods, which can be really valuable when you're dealing with new situations or limited historical data.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, you might conduct market surveys to gauge public interest in a new rail line or service. Ask people what they're looking for, what features are most important to them, how much they'd be willing to pay.
So it's about understanding potential demand before you even have a product to sell.
Precisely. And there are other techniques, like scenario writing, which is less about predicting a single outcome and more about exploring different possibilities. It's about asking those what-if questions.
So instead of trying to predict one definitive future, you're acknowledging that there are multiple potential paths, and you need to be prepared for all of them.
Exactly. It's about being flexible and adaptable, which is especially important in a world that's constantly changing.
Makes sense. Are there other forecasting methods that fall into this category of embracing uncertainty and exploring multiple potential outcomes?
Definitely. Another one is the Delphi method, which involves gathering a group of experts and having them debate and discuss the future of, say, high-speed rail.
So it's about tapping into that collective intelligence and getting a range of perspectives.
Precisely. And it can be a powerful way to challenge assumptions and identify potential blind spots.
It seems like we've only just scratched the surface of this forecasting toolkit.
Oh, we've got a lot more ground to cover. For example, have you ever heard of fuzzy logic? It's a way of dealing with uncertainty that's really fascinating.
Fuzzy logic. I can't say I have. It sounds a bit like something out of a science fiction novel.
Maybe so, but it's actually a really powerful tool for dealing with real-world complexity. It's all about acknowledging that things aren't always black and white. There are often shades of gray.
So instead of saying this is definitely going to happen, fuzzy logic embraces the maybes.
Exactly. It's about presenting a range of possibilities, each with its own probability of occurring.
So it's less about predicting the future with absolute certainty and more about understanding the full spectrum of what might happen.
You've got it. And fuzzy logic is just one example of the increasingly sophisticated tools being used in rail demand forecasting. We're even seeing things like neural networks, which are inspired by the way our own brains process information.
Neural networks. That sounds incredibly complex.
It is complex, but also incredibly powerful. It highlights just how much is going into these predictions about the future of rail travel.
It's pretty amazing to think about all these different approaches, from those simple projections to these super high-tech neural networks. But before we get too far down the track, I guess it's important to remember that rail demand isn't just one thing, is it?
Absolutely not. It's tempting to lump all rail users into one big group, but that's not how it works in reality. You've got business travelers, you've got folks heading out on vacation, daily commuters.
Right, and each one with their own set of priorities and travel patterns.
Exactly. A business traveler hopping on a high-speed train to a big meeting has different needs than, say, a family taking the train on vacation.
So it's kind of like different segments of the market, each with its own unique flavor. Let's unpack those a bit, starting with those business travelers. What makes them tick? What are the big factors that influence their transportation choices?
Well, for a lot of business travelers, it really boils down to time. Time is money, right?
Right.
So they need to get where they're going as quickly and efficiently as possible. A delayed train could mean a missed meeting, a lost opportunity.
So speed and reliability are at the top of their list.
Absolutely. Think high-speed rail lines connecting those major business hubs. Those are designed with that kind of traveler in mind.
Makes you wonder how much those business travelers factored into the decision to build those lines in the first place. Okay, so we got our time crunch business travelers. What about those leisure travelers, those folks taking the train for pleasure? What are they looking for?
Leisure travelers are a different breed. They're often more budget conscious, and they're looking for an enjoyable experience. They might be willing to sacrifice a bit of speed if it means a more comfortable ride or a chance to enjoy some scenic views.
Right, for them, it's not just about the destination. It's about the journey itself.
Exactly. It's about that overall experience. They're looking for value, but that value can encompass comfort, affordability, maybe even a sense of adventure.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've got those who are traveling for work, those traveling for pleasure, and then we have those who rely on rail travel every single day. The commuters. They're the backbone of many urban rail systems. What are some of the key things to keep in mind when forecasting demand for commuter rail?
Commuters, they're all about predictability, affordability, and knowing that the system will get them where they need to be on time every time.
Reliability is key.
Huge. And because they're using the system day in and day out, even small changes in service or pricing can have a big impact on their choices.
Right, it becomes part of their routine.
Exactly. A comfortable seat for that daily commute can make all the difference, too.
Oh, I can imagine. Nobody wants to be crammed into a packed train car during rush hour.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about the passenger side of things, but there's a whole other world of rail demand out there, and that's freight.
Oh, right. Moving all those goods. It's easy to forget about that part of the equation.
Yeah.
I imagine forecasting freight demand comes with its own unique set of challenges, right? What are some of the key differences between forecasting for passengers and freight?
It's a whole different ballgame in a lot of ways. When you're talking about passengers, you're trying to predict individual choices and preferences. With freight, it's all about efficiency, cost effectiveness, moving goods from point A to point B as smoothly as possible.
So it's less about individual whims and more about the cold, hard economics of logistics.
You got it. And one of the big differences is the type of shipment. You might have massive bulk shipments, like carloads of coal, which require completely different logistics than, say, individual packages being shipped across the country.
Right, so those forecasting models need to be able to handle those variations in scale and logistics.
Exactly. And then there's the whole competitive landscape to consider. Railways aren't the only game in town when it comes to moving goods. They're constantly competing with trucking companies, especially over shorter distances.
So there's a constant tug of war between rail and road.
That's a great way to put it. Railways need to offer competitive pricing, reliable service, and super streamlined procedures to win over businesses that might otherwise just opt for trucks.
They've really got to stay ahead of the curve.
Absolutely. And all of these factors, the type of goods being shipped, the distances involved, the competitive landscape, all of that has to be factored into those freight demand forecasts.
It's incredible how many moving parts there are in both passenger and freight forecasting. So with all these different forecasting methods we've talked about and all these different types of rail users, how does a rail planner even know where to begin? How do they choose the right approach?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There's no magic formula, but a good place to start is by considering the time horizon. How far into the future are you trying to predict demand?
Right, the time horizon. Makes sense. If you're just trying to get a handle on next year's budget, you probably don't need to dust off the neural networks.
Exactly. A simple model might do the trick for those shorter-term projections. But when you're talking about something like a massive new high-speed rail corridor, a project that could take decades to complete, well, you need a totally different approach. Something far more robust, like an econometric model, that can really dig into those long-term economic trends, those evolving travel patterns.
So the further out you're looking, the more sophisticated your crystal ball needs to be. But even with the most sophisticated models, there's always going to be some level of uncertainty, right? I mean, who could have predicted something like the pandemic and the massive impact that had on travel patterns?
You're hitting on a really crucial point. The pandemic was a stark reminder that even the best forecasts can be thrown off course by those unforeseen events, those black swan events that nobody sees coming. And it's not just pandemics. You've got economic downturns, political instability, even extreme weather events. All of these things can disrupt travel patterns and make accurate forecasting incredibly challenging.
So how do you even begin to navigate that level of uncertainty? Do you just throw your hands up and say, all right, who knows what the future holds?
Well, you could try that, but seriously, it's not about giving up. It's about acknowledging that uncertainty is a given and building that understanding into your models, into your planning processes. It's about being flexible, being adaptable.
So instead of trying to predict one definitive future, it's more about being prepared for multiple possibilities.
Exactly, and that's where those qualitative methods we talked about, like scenario planning, can be incredibly valuable. By exploring a range of what-if scenarios, those rail planners can start to anticipate potential challenges, potential opportunities, and develop strategies that are adaptable to those changing circumstances.
So it's kind of like that old saying, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. But in this case, it's more like prepare for a whole range of possibilities, because the future is full of surprises.
Well said. It's about moving away from this idea of forecasting as a way to predict the future with 100% certainty. It's more about embracing it as a tool for navigating complexity, for making better decisions, even when the path ahead is a bit murky.
It's about understanding those limitations, but also appreciating the power of forecasting to help us plan for a more connected, more sustainable future.
Exactly. And it all starts with understanding the methods behind those predictions, which is what we've been exploring today.
It's been a fascinating journey. Thanks to our expert for guiding us through this intricate world of rail demand forecasting. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us here on The Deep Dive. We'll leave you with this thought-provoking question to ponder. As technology continues to evolve and our world becomes even more interconnected, what role will rail travel play in shaping the future of transportation? Until next time, safe travels, everyone.